So welcome again. I'm Dr. Carrie Mendoza. I'm the Director of FAIR in Medicine, which is part of the Foundation Against Intolerance and Racism. I am an emergency medicine physician in the Midwest, and I am honored today to be discussing understanding our gender modification laws in Missouri. We have two very special guests. First, we have lawyer, legal expert Vernadette Broyles, who's president and general counsel of Child and Parental Rights Campaign. She's an undergraduate from Yale University, where she studied biology and pre-med, but then she went off to law school at Harvard Law School, and she's dedicated to the welfare of children, and she has been practicing in this area, so we're excited to have her share her thoughts here. We also are lucky to have Jamie Reed. She has a Bachelor of Arts in Cultural Anthropology from University of Missouri at St. Louis and a Master's of Science in Clinical Research Management from WashU. She had been working at WashU for 7 years, initially with HIV positive patients and caring for the transgender community. From 2018 until November 2022, she worked as a case manager at the WashU's Pediatric Transgender Center at St. Louis Children's Hospital. And she had a lot of day-to-day duties that you have as a case manager, which she will share with us. And I'm so thankful to have you both. And I think Jamie's going to start off by sharing her experience as a case manager at the Children's Hospital with the Transgender Center. So we can start off hearing about that and her affidavit that grew from her experience. So I'll pass it over to you, Jamie.
Thank you, Carrie, and thank you everyone for joining us today. I'm going to share a few slides on my screen to start with. So let's see if we can get those up. So many of you are probably familiar. I completely came out of nowhere. No one had ever heard of me before February 8th, 2023. The next day, a piece was published in the Free Press. It was titled, "I Thought I Was Saving Trans Kids, and Now I'm Blowing the Whistle." I was a case manager in the Pediatric Transgender Center at St. Louis Children's Hospital, and I worked on a very small team. I was the only case manager. I was also working as the research coordinator. We had one designated nurse, 2 endocrinologists, an adolescent medicine provider, and we had part-time 2 psychologists and 1 psychiatrist. I think I was on a team that's very similar to some of the other teams that we probably see in the other centers across the country. On the screen, you see in that top corner, the initial piece by the Free Press, and then tons of the follow-up article titles. I was very shocked by the number of pieces that my humble written word kind of sparked. So I want to do a brief timeline for the center that I worked at. So in 2017, the Pediatric Transgender Center opened in St. Louis. When we opened, we were following what was considered the Endocrine Society guidelines. As I later grew to learn, those are very low quality evidence. So I worked there from 2018 until the middle of 2022. In 2018, the American Academy of Pediatrics published their policy statement. And then when I went to leave, WPATH had finally published SOC 8, so the Standard of Care 8 was released. So during my entire tenure, we were operating under SOC 7. And then it was February 9th, like I said, when the Free Press article was released. So real briefly, I just want to go over some of the concerns that kind of led me to become a whistleblower. So when I initially started at the center, I completed all of the intakes, which I'll get to in a few minutes, which is a very common role for the social work position within these centers, is to be the intake coordinator. So what I was seeing was a change in the presenting cases and the number of cases. So when I initially started, I was handling 5, 7, 10 new patient phone calls per month. By the time I left, it was common. Most months had 50 new intakes coming in, which was a rapid increase of over a small number of years, which is part of what led me to really believe in this concept of social contagion and this rapid onset of gender dysphoria, because also I saw a huge change in the cases that were presenting. They were, by the time I left, most of the kids were assigned female at birth. Our average was about 70 to 80% of our cases. And most of the youth were coming to us at age 16 and had only been discussing a gender identity that barely hit the 6-month mark. I initially also saw that there was conflicting and a real lack of robust clinical guidelines. So this field does not have any clear, tight guidelines, and there was lots of conflicts amongst the staff and trying to figure out how these patients even fit within what guidelines were out there to start with. And my center, like probably every other center across this nation, and what we saw in the Tavistock, is we were woefully understaffed and completely under-resourced. What I started seeing long-term was that these patients were having really poor assessments, really significant mental health concerns. They were not having their mental health treated, yet were being medicalized through the use of puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, and surgeries. And then what I also started to see was that we were having more and more cases of detransitioners and desisting patients. So I want to segue into just a little bit to talk about what I did as an intake kind of coordinator. So intakes is kind of a fancy word for this really long phone call that we did to triage our patients. I would almost always be speaking with an affirming parent. That was who would be the one to contact. But when I wasn't, I would be talking to a parent who had concerns or questions, and I would find myself substituting my judgment for those. So if parents would tell me that their child would have a preferred name and pronoun, I would immediately in the phone call start jumping into using that, even if the parents weren't. We would use these subtle shaming tactics to point out to any non-affirming or questioning or concerning parent that we were right and they were wrong. The only resources that we provided were affirming. So the only list of therapists that we had were therapists that we knew would affirm their child's gender identity and not really question it. I also worked to train all of the staff and the rest of the hospital to provide this kind of affirming care. So we trained the other doctors in the other divisions that if a parent had a kid in the hospital, potentially for nothing gender related, and the parent was not using pronouns, we would go around that parent's decision and discretion and do so. So I trained staff to affirm a child even directly against the wishes of their parents. The affirming parents would make it known on the phone to me sometimes that the other parents did not agree with this treatment, that the other parent was potentially in opposition to this whole gender thing. But I would give these affirming parents the green light to schedule the appointments with their doctors who prescribe the hormones. I initially did that even when the affirming parents directly told me that they had a custody agreement and the other parent wasn't in agreement. I think that my practices are probably very common. And what we'll hear later from Vernadette is that these kind of practices are actually becoming law now in some states. I took a really long time for me to understand what I was doing to parents and families. But in the end, I was directly harming parent-child relationships and also creating additional wedges in families where the parents were not in agreement. What we would do is we would get the kids in with the affirming parents. We would go through all the steps, and then we'd reach out and contact the non-affirming parent and say, basically, you're it now. If you say no, we're going to make it all be that you're the red light. So many times those other parents would say things to us like, you're going to do this anyway, or I feel like I can't say no. I also know that there were affirming parents who would lie and claim that they had sole legal custody. And I finally came to the point where I was pushing the other staff, so I was at least trying to get custody agreements ahead of time before we would send in prescriptions. But what I came to realize is there are not a lot of other people, I think, like me, who are working in these centers. We were not treating ear infections. We were prescribing puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, and we were permanently sterilizing children. We were permanently changing their bodies. And I owe an apology to so many parents, but there were so many dads, and I was really thinking about this yesterday with Father's Day. There are so many dads who are fighting for their kids, who were fighting against the moms, they're fighting the kids themselves, and they're directly fighting our team. Often these dads were fighting for the simplest and most reasonable things: more time in therapy, therapy with a provider who would actually explore where their child's gender identity was coming from. They were just begging mental health professionals to do proper psychotherapy. These dads were fighting against not just my team, but, as we'll see now, state laws, the courts themselves, and doctors who were ideologically invested in medicalizing their kids. These dads would come to their appointments with printed out scientific articles. Sometimes they were scientists themselves, and we would never back down. We would never back down when one parent was saying yes and the kid was demanding these treatments. We would just push and push and push and shame and malign. And sometimes we would even poke fun at these dads in our team meetings. We act as if they had patriarchal issues or if they were deadbeats who didn't know or love their kids, and we really tore these families apart. These were the kind of cases that really pushed me to become a whistleblower. And it was that, in combination with seeing that these treatments were not working, we were not helping these kids. These kids were getting worse. So I want to just kind of move on to a little bit about this idea about where we all fit in this. So as a whistleblower, I have a very unique perspective. I can draw back the curtain. If people have questions about what's going on in these centers, I have lived experience that I can talk about, but I am just one tiny small piece of this puzzle. And everybody who has concerns about this care really has a place. So what I think is that sometimes I was just one tiny little spark, but so many of us have the other necessary elements and qualities and ability to really push for change. So from parents' perspectives to the legal perspectives to legislative perspectives, even the ability to talk and add comments in, national articles. We need everybody to continue to push and to ask questions and to be more and more of the sparks that kind of really can hopefully ignite way more change. So I'm going to kind of tag my time over to Vernadette, and then I know we're going to have a lot of time for Q&A at the end. So please feel free to ask or think about any questions you might have about what's going on in these centers. I do think that the center that I worked at was not unique in any way. And then I just have one little quote. So there comes a time when the operation of the machine is so odious that you cannot even tacitly participate. You have got to place your body on the gears, the wheels, all of the mechanisms, and you've got to indicate to those who own it and to those who run it that the machine will be prevented from working at all. And in my true leftist fashion, that is from Utah Phillips.
Wow, Jamie, thank you. Thank you so much. I know it's just such a powerful story, but just being honest about, the awareness of what was going on and the role you were playing is hard to do. So thank you for doing that. I think that is a spark for others to come forward. So we'll pass it over to Vernadette to give us, put the legal context in and bring us up to speed too with all that's going on in that area. So over to you, Vernadette. Yeah.
Sure. Thank you, Carrie. And thank you so much for having us both. But I honestly, there's one other question I want to press for Jamie. And that is because it'll be a perfect segue into what I want to share, which is what is happening across the country, what has happened this last legislative session across this country with laws being passed to protect children and then now moving into the litigation phase. But I think the really important question for Jamie is, really, was Washington University, or is it a one-off? Or is there reason to believe that these same sort of practices that she's blown the whistle on is actually representative of centers and clinics around the country? And I'd love for her to answer that before I even share my part.
Absolutely. And I'm also going to answer the anonymous attendee with an apology. So absolutely, the comment was, please, no one is assigned sex at birth. Biological sex is determined at conception. I hope that you and many others can have patience with us who worked on the inside. It is very difficult for me to rethink my language. I worked in that center for almost 5 years, really, and have operated within this mindset. And part of what happens in these centers is we policed each other a lot, and we taught others to police each other too. And so one of the things I've been so refreshed by being out on the other side is nobody has actually told me that I was wrong for having thoughts or using phrases like that. But working in those centers, you have to toe the line. And to answer Vernadette's question, the center that I worked at is completely representative of probably all of the other centers within the United States, and probably on the conservative side. So if you think of our timeline, centers were already in full operation on the coasts way before this center even opened. And one of the things about being a Midwesterner is we know that it takes a long time for things to kind of trickle into the center of our country. The ways that I know that we were not a one-off, the doctors that I work with trained with the other endocrinologists across the country. We attended conferences as a team, and we saw and knew that what we were doing in our practices lined up directly with other practices at those conferences. There's also a listserv that is used by almost all of the gender clinics across this country. And there were often times when I had coworkers say to me things like, Jamie, you have concerns about what we're doing, but read this off the listserv. And they would directly show that other centers were actually like farther outfield than even we were. So I have no qualms saying that this center probably represented the middle ground in what is going on.
All right. So Carrie, if you'd like me to just sort of come in on the tail end of that, I'll be happy to do that. I was looking at some of the Q&A, and I'm going to have to restrain myself from going at it.
Yeah, we're like, again, we are so thankful you both are here. So
Yeah.
honestly,
Okay.
if you want to say a few words, but we can also weave in the questions right now.
I'm going to weave in a quick question about the whistleblower protection. So Jamie, yes, thankfully, we were able to obtain for her whistleblower protection by virtue of going to the appropriate government official with oversight over these type of activities, which was the Missouri Attorney General, and made a formal complaint concerning what she observed, and provided, a sworn affidavit. And that has kicked off an official investigation into the activities of this center, as well as additional investigations by the Department of Social Services and two of the licensing board, the Healing Arts Licensing Board that governs the practice of medicine in Missouri. And the name of it is a little odd, so I just call it the Mental Health Licensing Board that governs, mental health professionals, because of course that's, that profession is highly involved in these activities. So that is ongoing. And for any other whistleblowers out there, I want to appeal to you. I say this very sincerely. Jamie Reed is perhaps the most courageous person I know. She has put her entire life on the line. Like her entire life, to just do what is right. And thankfully, the laws do provide protections for whistleblowers like Jamie Reed. So if there are any other people who are in centers, in clinics, and they're realizing we're hurting kids, we're not helping them, please do come forward. Our website, contact me through our website, which is childparentrights.org, parentrights.org, and maybe we can get that somewhere out in the chat. There's a contact there, contact me. One of us will get right back to you to respond to you. But with that being said, let me go into what's happening now to protect children across the country. We have seen, partly as a result of whistleblowers like this, as a result of doctors raising concerns about these, and parents raising concerns about the effects of these treatments on developing children's bodies. 20 states around the country, this legislative session passed laws and statutes to ban these treatments in minors. Except, and what these treatments are, let's be clear about that. So these are puberty blockers that were intended for, treatment of prostate cancer and to treat precocious puberty. If a child is 6 years old and getting their period, that's too soon to hold it off for, a few years. They were never FDA approved for treating a child that should be getting their moving into puberty for the purpose of gender dysphoria. So puberty blockers being improperly used, cross-sex hormones being overdosed for a child's based on the child's sex, and then a whole variety of surgeries that, yes, are happening to minors. They absolutely are. Minors are getting double breast mastectomies. We have the stories. I even have a story of a minor young man who had his penis and testicles removed. Actually, he had just turned 18. It started when he was 17. Okay. But in any case, we do know that even those surgeries are happening in minors. So 20 states, and I'm going to read them out. And I'm going to ask for our listeners, jot it down if your state is mentioned, because there are things that you can do to help. So the state of Alabama, Arkansas, Arizona, Georgia, Iowa, Kentucky, Mississippi, South Dakota, Tennessee, Utah, West Virginia, Indiana, Idaho, North Dakota, Montana, Oklahoma, Florida, Nebraska, Texas, and Missouri. And if we have time later on, I'll read that again, but I'm going to keep going. In Georgia, they prohibited puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones. They didn't get to the surgeries, and I believe that we'll work on that next session. So now, how are these enforced? It's a whole. There's not time to get into all the nitty-gritty, but generally speaking, they're enforced by one of several mechanisms. All of them provide a private right of action of lawsuit, and many of them actually increase the statute of limitations to be able to bring lawsuits. And if anyone has a particular question, we can answer a particular state's details about a particular state. For most of them, they allow for enforcement through the licensing agency to be able to go after the doctor's license who has prescribed these treatments against the law. That's in addition to lawsuits. And then for some of these states, there's also criminal penalties for the doctor, not for the parents or not for the child, obviously, whom we generally consider as victims of these treatments, but for the doctors. There's many of them have criminal penalties. Now that we're past the legislative stage, though, we're now moving into a litigation phase. And Carrie, all of these states are going to be sued. And many of these states already have been sued. All right, so and it's typically, Lambda Legal, the ACLU, Human Rights Campaign, those types of lawyers who are activist advocacy law firms, law practices, are bringing lawsuits against these states in order to have their laws being enjoined or prohibited from being implemented, all right, through preliminary injunction and then ultimately through having them struck down through the courts. So all of this is now going to play out in the courts. And that's really where this is all going to decide whether we're going to have protections for our children. Now, the states that have been sued that we're aware of, we've been trying to track all of these, is Alabama, that's been going on for a year now. Arizona has been sued for their ban on paying for these treatments. Florida has been sued for both their ban on the treatments as well as their ban on paying for the treatments. Indiana on the ban statute, Tennessee on their ban statute, Oklahoma on their ban statute. Those are the states that we are involved in, our law firm. And then we've learned that Nebraska and Montana have also been sued. Now, there may be a couple more suits out there, but those are the ones that we are aware of. And I'll stop there in case someone has questions, because I put out a lot of information. And before we're done, I want to talk about how people can get involved and help. But let's look at some of these questions.
Yeah, and I know, Jamie, thank you for jumping in and like answering some super helpful. You know, Vernadette, I wanted to ask you, what have been the protections against, and I think this happened in Florida, restricting nurse practitioner and PAs, because we find that those laws over, I'd say probably since Obamacare were really loosened up, I think in part to provide more access for folks. But I think what's happened is this confluence where perhaps like the training or the ability to kind of say no to certain situations is lost with mid-levels, or perhaps there isn't proper supervision. I think that there's several different factors. What have you read in the legislation about restricting NP and PAs from, you know, kind of this independent practice that might be driving some of this?
Sure. It's state by state. So I can't give you, you know, a blanket answer for all states. But generally speaking, many of these states and the statutes, and we were involved in the drafting of some of these statutes, they define medical professional broadly. So for many of these states, NPs and nurse practitioners and professionals like that would be part of the definition of the of medical providers that would be prohibited from giving these treatments. Because obviously, if you can go around the doctors and just find another provider to do this, you really haven't closed the door. You really haven't protected children very well. So most of these states that I'm aware of, I believe, have used a pretty broad definition of medical provider.
Okay, thanks. And I also think I've noticed, just in my practice in emergency medicine, also the proliferation, obviously, with telehealth, which was fueled during, COVID for obvious reasons. But I think that that's another area that they could use some help, because I don't think that there's proper restrictions related to telehealth prescribing. So, but they're.
Can I jump in, Carrie, real quick, just on the nurse practitioners in Florida? One of the things I know from my state is Planned Parenthood is huge in this medical care right now. And this is really hard for me because I actually I clinically managed a Planned Parenthood directly out of my undergrad. And Planned Parenthood relies almost solely on nurse practitioners and PAs. Oftentimes there's one actual medical director overseeing the entire facility, and almost all of the care is provided by NPs and PAs. And so that level of care is supposed to be, when you have a really clear standard of care, guidelines, things that can be handed off to NPs and PAs, because there's a really clear kind of consensus on decision-making protocols too. So I just think that part of putting this back in the hands of trained endocrinologists only in some of these laws does kind of take away this rapid push that we see out into the wider community from not just NPs, PAs, but also this really push to just have general practitioners even prescribing. So.
Yeah, that's a great point. And again, I think it's just like anything, there's nuance. I think that NPs and PAs can be fantastic. I mean, I know in my emergency medicine setting, they're indispensable, but what we have is we're all working together in a unit. So like if they have questions or they're not sure, there's, a hierarchy of knowledge, and we're there to kind of, help them and guide them. But I do think that if it's they're used to sort of like following a protocol and not deviating. And if the protocol is not correct, I think that that's one of the root causes here that is, gets proliferated and scaled up. Vernadette, could you just put a little more meat on the ideas, or just about whistleblower protections? There is someone here asking a question about that. I know you touched on a little bit, but with your employer, what protection is it? Depend on the state, what are sort of the everyday protections? If I say someone in Illinois, they saw something, what would be their protection against legal action or getting their license removed?
So one would have to do a state-by-state analysis to know, because this is a creature of state law, generally speaking. Now, there are whistleblower protections at the federal level, but we're generally speaking about the state practice of medicine and state law. So I wouldn't want to try to opine as to other states that we haven't researched, but generally speaking, states have a lot of similarities in these types of laws. And so what we found in Missouri, and there's going to be analogies to the other states, is that when a whistleblower makes a formal complaint to the governing authority that has jurisdiction and authority over consumer protection, over patient protection, and in Missouri, it's the Attorney General was the highest one, but also the Department of Social Services, as well as the licensing board. They all had some sort of jurisdiction in policing the area of medicine. So we started with the Attorney General because that was the highest one. And once you make that sort of formal complaint, and the AG does some due diligence and finds it to be basically credible, then the substance of that complaint, the employer cannot then turn around and fire you as a retaliatory measure and otherwise they are now subject to liability themselves for doing that, including with the Attorney General. Okay, so it provides this layer of protection that your employer cannot retaliate against you if you have made a credible whistleblower concerning practices that are putting patients' well-being at risk. Okay, so thankfully, Jamie's employer has abided by the law and has not engaged in a retaliatory, any significant retaliatory activity. And as a result, we've not had to sue them. And if they fired her, then yes, we would be authorized to bring a lawsuit and almost, would prevail and get a lot of damages on our behalf. So yes. Yeah.
Vernadette, are whistleblower complaints FOIA-able for, say, hospitals are receiving, Medicare, Medicaid dollars? Can you FOIA whistleblower complaints?
Well, because the whistleblower complaint is going to go to typically the Attorney General or some similar law enforcement agency like that. And those records become confidential because they become part of an official investigation. So my understanding of the open records laws would be that, generally speaking, no. Once an investigation opens, then those records are not subject to the Open Records Act. But
okay, Jamie, what do you think prevents other folks you work with from coming forward, or just maybe, even in a meeting saying, oh, wait, hey, I'm concerned about this? That'd be sort of part one. And then part two, did you guys have a system the hospital system I'm in has something called a Midas system where you can anonymously put in, concerns, like safety concerns? Did you all have, or is there a system like that folks can put in anonymous safety concerns to the hospital?
Those are really good questions, Carrie. Okay. So first of all, I was not the only staff member. I did feel for a number of years that I was not alone within the center in raising concerns. However, we were not the direct providers. So as what's sometimes considered support staff, we were on the team, on a multidisciplinary team, but there, at the end of the day, there is kind of a ranking system that goes to the prescribing physician, and the prescribing physician basically overrode the multidisciplinary team concerns. And that's something that I did speak up about, because I do think that some parents believed that their child's overarching case was assessed by this team, and we had a universal agreement, yes, your child should move forward with medicalization. I think some parents might be concerned to know that on my team of 8, there were many cases where 3 of us would say, no, we have concerns, we are opposed to the medicalization, yet because we were not the prescribing physician, the child was still prescribed to. That's part one. Part two is that I also think a lot of those systems you talked about in hospitals are created, again, directly for the physicians. But I will say that we actually reached out directly to our physicians and said things like, hey, this patient who experienced this vaginal laceration and ended up in surgery in the emergency room, shouldn't this be reported in some sort of mechanism? This is an adverse event. This is a serious adverse event. Doesn't this need to be reported? And we would be directly told no. We were directly told things like, no, these are expected side effects. We expect these terrible outcomes to occur. So when we would look into and try to find those reporting systems, we were directly discouraged not to use them. And then also, in similar ways that the Tavistock whistleblowers experienced, we experienced, kind of top-down bullying, where we would raise a concern in a meeting with the team, with the physicians, and then I would be called into a Zoom meeting the next day with an administrative leader who said, you have to stop questioning the doctors, or the tone of the way that you question the doctors was wrong, or you need to leave some of the prescribers off of these emails. It was to the point where at least my team did not want to have robust discussions and concerns about these things. This is what we do. If the child wants hormones, one parent says yes, and they have a letter, regardless of the fact that the letter was written after 1 or 2 sessions, we prescribe these drugs. It is the path that we do. This is the way it goes. You can either be on board with it going this way, or you need to stop working here.
So Carrie, there was a question in the chat about,
Yeah.
Are there therapists? Are there, people that parents can find to take their child or young person to for help with the underlying, comorbidities, the underlying reasons why a young person is turning their back on their sex, is disliking their body. And yes, there are. And that, by the way, that's not conversion therapy. I'm so sorry. You're not converting anyone to anything when you're helping them understand what trauma may be involved, when you're doing good exploratory therapy to understand the reasons for the distress that these young people are in. And you're not converting anyone to anything if you're assisting them to become comfortable with their sex. That's their body. So I soundly reject that. And yes, we do know we have allies. In fact, I just spent an hour and a half in Zoom with a really wonderful therapist out of Texas. There are therapists out there that are doing good exploratory work with young people. They just kind of keep it kind of quiet because of the atmosphere they're in. But I do want to say this to medical professionals before I talk with parents and how they can get involved and help, because people are getting to the point where we're getting fed up with watching this happen and feeling like we're being bulldozed by something we know is harmful and is not helping is hurting our kids. There's a number of people in the chat here or in the Q&A that are medical professionals, and that are saying, we don't agree with this. What do we do? Well, I would say medical professionals join with others, find a few others that number one, you can petition your medical association to demand that they do a thorough literature review and look at the actual evidence behind these treatments, because they are poor or non-existent. There is not a single controlled study done on any of these treatments to establish that they are safe and effective, or they're superior to any other to good talk therapy, or that they're safe. So number one. Number two, begin to write and as Jamie did, and show that no, the majority of the medical community is not comfortable with this, has concerns about this, and begin to speak up in public settings or in written settings to establish that no, there are doctors that have definite concerns about this. But Carrie, before I go, I do want, how much more time do we have? Because
we have more than a half hour more time.
Okay.
We have more time. Yeah. So you keep going, but we'll put in GEDA is a great organization. We'll put that info in. GenSpect. Obviously, they can contact you. They can contact me. We're all out there to help. But yeah, go ahead. Keep going, Vernadette.
Well, I have to tell the other side of things, because for all the states that have passed these patient protections, I don't want to call them bans, I want to talk, they're patient protections. There are also other states that are going way off the deep end on the other side. So, for instance, California they have passed a law that causes them to become a sanctuary state for basically kidnapping a child, taking the child to California and giving these treatments. If one of the parents wants to bring this child, a child to California and get these treatments over the objections of the other parents, well, California is now open for business. And California is looking at a law, it is actively considering in committee a bill that would call the failure, that would call affirming biological reality with your child, that is refusing to affirm the gender identity, as a form of child abuse. And therefore, that means that parent can lose custody to the other parent. That parent could lose custody to Child Protective Services. There is a bill that actually has passed in Washington State that allows a child to be housed in an emergency shelter, or a young person, over the objection of their parents, if you have parents that are not affirming their gender identity. I don't know exactly how young this goes down to, but I know it's younger than 18. And I won't go through it, but there are other states that are all, Minnesota is also a sanctuary state for these treatments. And there are several other states that are looking at laws to, again, make it called it child abuse if you are affirming biological reality for your child. So, we're really at an inflection point that if we don't stop and stand up, as Jamie has done, for the physical and mental health of our children and their futures, their ability to have a child themselves someday. These treatments sterilize children or impact their fertility, then we can lose a generation. And what I want to throw out there for what some of the things that parents can do, or allies of parents can do. Number one, we need parents' stories. I saw in the chat there, in the Q&A, this is describing my child. If you are a parent and you took your child to one of these gender specialists because you were told that they were going to commit suicide if you don't, and they were either not helped or they were harmed, we need your story, particularly in any of the 20 states that are or going to be litigating these cases. We need testimony to push back on the stories that the other side is providing. Or if you're a parent and you went to one of these centers or a gender specialist for help because you were told that's where you need to go, and you were coerced, you were told if you don't agree to this, your child is going to commit suicide, and you were told that right in front of your child, which is how they do this, or these treatments were administered despite your objections, that we really need these stories and we really need your testimony. I really urge you, get in touch with us, please. Detransitioners. If you have been, you're a young person, you have been subjected to some of these treatments and you realize this is a grave mistake and you're detransitioning, your testimony is probably the most powerful thing in that courtroom. We have a number of detransitioners who have come forth. They're acting as witnesses in our cases. They're giving affidavits and they're willing to give live testimony. And it is so powerful to debunk this lie that children are born in the wrong body and they never regret it. It's innate and immutable, this gender identity, and they'll never regret it. Well, no, we have detransitioners that said, I was that kid and I was certain I needed these treatments that I went through. And now I'm realizing that no, I didn't need it after all. And it actually harmed me. And then finally, if you would be willing to financially support us and support our efforts, Child and Parental Rights Campaign, we are litigating these cases. We are litigating parents whose child had been secretly transitioned in school by government officials behind their parents' back and sometimes over their parents' objection. We have one child that attempted suicide at school because of this in Florida. And we have agreed to take a case. I won't give the names, but of a young lady out of Virginia who was transitioned secretly, as a result, ran away, was raped and sex trafficked by virtue of being removed from the protection of her family, including after being taken in by Child Protective Services in another state. So it is a horrific story. We're taking that case. It's going to be a battle. So if you want to support our litigation efforts, which are very, very expensive, you can go onto our website, childparentrights.org/donate, or just, click on the donate button. So those are some of the ways that you can get involved and you can help.
Wow. Well, there's so much, and we do have more time, Vernadette, but that is so great. I want to remind people there's lots of maps out there, but at Fair in Medicine, we've tried to aggregate, what we think is important with the sanctuary states. As Vernadette was mentioning, I practice and live in Illinois, and Illinois is one of those. It's like they copy the statutes from California. And then New York is like that. Maryland recently passed something, and it kind of gets mixed in with like civil rights, Vernadette, and maybe you could speak to that, because I know when Obamacare was passed in 2008, and then several years after that, they wrote in Section 1557, they wrote civil rights language into medical law. And one would say, well, the civil rights laws were passed in the 60s. Why do you have to sort of have separate, special, additional laws? But that seems to be one of the strategies, because then I think the health systems are then concerned, like, well, if I don't offer these services, I'm going to be accused of violating rights. And then I think gender identity got mixed in there. So I have like a couple questions, or comments. Could you speak towards the issue with civil rights getting mixed in with healthcare? And then I also have seen in reading the psychotherapy bans, which is what I call them, not conversion bans, that gender identity has gotten conflated with sexual orientation, which we know, you can't change someone's sexual orientation, but we see with gender identity that there's that is something that it is not fixed. And there's times when it can't be fixed. And it seems like there's this cohort, especially these adolescent girls, where they're taking on this identity, but it's then, then they drop it after they've been medicalized, as you point out with the detransitioners. And so I feel like the laws kind of are trying to harden gender identity and sexual orientation. And then that brings us to this moment where they're trying to close the doors on options like psychotherapy. So those are kind of more comments, but maybe you could speak a little bit more to the civil rights and then the conflating sexual orientation with gender identity.
Sure.
And then Vernadette, can you also answer the most pressing question in the Q&A, which is when will these cases reach SCOTUS?
Yes,
okay.
yes.
All
I'm
right.
keeping my eye on that. Yeah, well, that'll be, answer that, please. That'd be great.
Okay, well, let's start with your first question and make sure I get to that last one. But what they're doing is that they're conflating two completely different things. And I believe that it's very purposeful. I have to just say, they're conflating medical decision-making, medical care, medical decisions with and biological reality with civil rights. And the two are very, very different, because in fact, it's almost turning things on its head, because the more you put emphasis, if you just assume and assert that gender identity is a innate and immutable quality, therefore it's entitled to basic civil rights protection, then you've made it untouchable. It doesn't even matter whether it's medically necessary anymore. It doesn't even matter if there's actual medical evidence behind it. You have now elevated it to a place that you can't touch it. But the problem is that there is no evidence that is true, that is the case. There has been no evidence that gender identity is innate or immutable, as is attested to by the many detransitioners. There's no biological etiology to this. And so I feel like they're trying to equate it to race, age, ethnicity, sex, to give it put at the same level, and it is not. All right. So we need to make sure we keep this at the level of, these are medical decisions, and because they are medical decisions, they need to be underpinned with the best, because we're talking about developing young people, developing children who have the entire lives and reproductive histories and sexual functioning ahead of them. That they have to be underpinned by effective and accurate and appropriate evidence, and they're not, and that is the problem. I distinguish that from, people are fully grown, over 25 years old, their brain is fully developed, and they make these decisions. I don't address those. I push that aside. But for developing children, no, they must be protected from medical decisions and practices that destroy their sexual function. We're not talking about an ability to not have appropriate sex the rest of your life or have a child. They need to be protected. And so I say that the law is on the side of states being able to protect them, as opposed to being able to harden their ability to harm themselves by virtue of professional advising them to do so. Okay. To get to Jamie's question, so our school district lawsuits that are moving forward in several states, and then we have all the treatment bans lawsuits that we're helping out in. Eventually this is all getting to the Supreme Court. I mean, it has to. Our school district lawsuits, we have a couple of cases that we think would be good candidates to get, but we're probably talking 2 to 3 years from now, because they got to go through the Circuit Court of Appeals, and then up to the Supreme Court, and it's hard to get accepted by the Supreme Court. So I would say a solid couple of years from now at minimum, to answer your question. Now, the treatment bans, they might go quicker, because we're talking about attorney generals, and that's states that are litigators, and states get priority when they appeal to the Supreme Court. So we could be looking at some of these treatment ban decisions going up to the Supreme Court sooner, but even still, we're probably still talking like another couple of years.
Yeah, and that's why I think some of the suggestions that have been made and Jamie's moral courage, just for people to, speak out, whether you mentioned Vernadette at the schools, I feel that, obviously what they're doing, it's like a medical pipeline. I think to me, people have heard me talk a lot about my experience with the opioid epidemic. I mean, I started practicing before that started, saw it happening. obviously in the ER dealing with overdoses, saw the pain clinics prescribing, but disconnected from the adverse effects. Pain, so I feel that that's some of this, or they prescribe, they're only on one side of the equation, but there are overdoses that, it was just basically ignored. And there are regulations that tied pain scale scores to reimbursement to the hospital and bonuses for the hospital and doctors. And so, that was some of the fuel that led to the opioid crisis, which we still live with. And, so I did my part during that time. I would speak out. I refused to prescribe. I mean, there was no one that had my back or other doctors speaking out, but I just could never do anything that was wrong or made it worse. But it was, there's parallel with this idea of like, well, you're a bad doctor because you're not treating their pain. But what you both are bringing out is it's not compassionate when you're fueling people to be dysfunctional. And you're harming them. So unfortunately, we're in this phase with our healthcare system in the States that often happens because of this consumerism and marketing directly to patients. And also, I think what's not talked about a lot is that because our system is basically kind of technically bankrupt, and when Medicare and Medicaid were started, the population of people over 65 and people who were on disability and getting health benefits was much smaller. And I think that anything in the healthcare system that is a new market is part of the fuel that causes it to scale in the United States. And I saw that with the pain clinics, because it was a new cost center that they could start out by having a lot of reimbursements, and there wasn't a lot of oversight, so they didn't have to invest a lot in the management. And it just kind of scaled up like crazy, causing so many problems. And I think the gender clinic situation is like that too, because it's cost shifting for a lot of states and health systems that are having a hard time managing like their Medicare and Medicaid population. So I just think those are some things that, physicians and people within healthcare need to be honest about and speak up about. As it's not just going to be going up to the Supreme Court. The people working in the system have to speak out when there's safety concerns, and like Jamie did. And I know there are some questions in here, Jamie, or a couple about, and I think you touch on a little bit, but have you had a lot of people within other clinics across the country reaching out to you more specifically, kind of saying, say like in California or other places that are like in Illinois that's across the border from you, that are, hey, I'm, really concerned about this. Like, what can I do?
So
Yeah.
I have not directly heard from a lot of individuals who work within gender centers. I think that there has been an intentional push within gender centers in the United States. I think that gender centers hire activists primarily. When I left the center I was at, I was replaced by 3 individuals, 2 who I believe identify as trans themselves. There is a push to hire trans identified individuals and others in the community into those positions. So I do think you not only have some ideological capture, but then the amount that somebody would have to step out is just so wide of a gap. I think that's different in other centers internationally, which is why we probably saw so many whistleblowers out of the Tavistock in England. I'll also just kind of say this. I've seen a number of questions in the chat from other people who work in medical care. There's been some conversation around the requirement to use identifying pronouns with medical staff. I I think one of the things I saw within the hospital I worked at is any rubber band that gets pulled way too far has to just organically snap back, right? So it only has a breaking point. I think we were starting to see that breaking point at Children's because we were starting to get patients who were coming into the emergency room who were requesting the staff to use pronouns like it, rock, mushroom, things where the staff just felt like they were themselves reaching that breaking point. You can only ask so much of individuals before they just say, no, we're way too out in left field. And so those were sometimes the staff, and they were saying, yeah, no, I'm not doing that. I'm just gonna use no pronouns now. That's an easier situation than doing this. Which I think is a reasonable proposition, but I still would like to see shifts to acknowledge that changing names and pronouns is an element of social transition, and social transition is not a benign act. It is an intervention, and all intervention should be in the purview of parents to make the decision. So parents have the right to make medical decisions for their children. And if we acknowledge that social transition is an intervention, then it should be in the parental's purview to decide whether or not they're going to agree with that intervention.
Yeah. Did you all use Epic in your
Yes.
system? Or, okay.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I know, it was before the pandemic, but for us, people were registered with their biologic sex, and then if they identified as something different, it would be written in the margin, they like to be called X. But I did notice, at least in Epic, I don't know if they do it in Cerner, but or if it's hospital per hospital system, but that they register people now as what they identify with. And it's unclear to me how on the back end, from a safety standpoint, that's integrated. And I don't
that's a wonderful topic that came up within the hospital I worked at in the radiology division. So radiology reached out to our center and said, we need your assistance because we put someone into a scanning system and we had not run a pregnancy test because their Epic chart had them identified as male, but they were biologically female, still had a uterus. And those basic, we run a pregnancy test before we put somebody in a scanner that might potentially have tetragenic effects on a developing fetus. Like, there are so many medical questions that are grounded in biological sex, and treatment protocols and things that are grounded in biological sex, that medical care is doing a disservice to everyone if we completely ignore that reality. Even, Carrie, you know this more than I, but even if somebody needs to go on a ventilator, your lung capacity for a female versus a male is different, and you have to set the parameters of the machine to breathe for you differently based on those realities. So I really do not want to see medical care dig itself deeper into this hole and start providing poor care across the board because of this ideology.
Yeah, well, I mean, that is something that is happening. And as folks are called to action, what can they do? When you go to the hospital now, or even your clinic, you can certainly ask, do you properly register people? Because it is the near-term issue is, it really relates to pregnancy. I mean, there was a case report in the New England Journal, I think it was 2019, and Katie Herzog had tagged it in one of her articles for the Free Press early on, that, someone basically who was identifying as male, registered as male, but really was a female having abdominal pain and basically, had a miscarriage. But there's ectopic pregnancies. I've had situations where, students don't do proper GU exams because they were concerned about hurting someone's feelings. And I've detected, testicular masses. So like we're dealing with people's lives. So, you know, doctors have to stand up. You can't be scared of activist students, activist residents, activists, anybody. You're talking about people's lives. But the issue with the medical record is it's very, very serious. I personally, you know, had a situation with someone in their 80s who was not anything to do with transgender. And my nurse, he came in the ER, it wasn't critical, he was stable, but my nurse, for some reason, there was a whole section that my nurse couldn't advance past asking for this person's gynecologic history. This person was never transgender. Our Epic person couldn't figure out why it happened. She couldn't advance the record. So on the back end, these things are getting mixed up, and it's really serious for everybody to understand that you're not being compassionate or helping anyone's feelings mental health wise if the computer system is inaccurate.
Correct.
So that's very, very important, and people in hospitals can report those type of things, and you really need to. If you only think of your own family coming in, do you want them to accidentally you know, not have the proper care because of the electronic record? The other thing, Jamie, I'm curious, and Vernadette, I don't know if you've seen this come across, is, you know, a lot of electronic health systems are larded up with quote unquote decision support tools. It's just really junky AI or information like up to date that's integrated in. But if you look at up to date on the gender section, it's really all out of date and activist. And the thing is, there's a generation of people, and maybe those who are more reliant on protocols and not comfortable overriding things that are on a computer that are wrong, that it's telling them certain things in there, and it's integrated into the system in the hospital or clinics. And that really needs to be looked at, because that's really like not accurate information. Did you find, Jamie, were people looking at, like, was up to date integrated into?
Yes.
And did
but
people just look at that? It's all out of date, really bad.
There's other elements too in this situation in medicine that, you know, concerns me. On the flip side, I am concerned about transitioned adults who transitioned, you know, I know so many people who transitioned 20, 30 years ago who do not deny their biological sex, who want good medical care, who want to be able to go to their doctor and have a real conversation with their doctor about, these are the body parts I have. I need medical care to look after these body parts, but don't push or need a system to completely throw all of that out, you know, out of, like, it doesn't it doesn't provide good medical care to anyone. At the end of the day, it doesn't, because then what you have is radiology departments thinking that the shift should be, we're going to ask every single this was the idea of the solution. Instead of having a clear way to identify biological sex and gender changes, their solution was, we should just ask every single person if they have a uterus.
Yeah.
Like every single person. Like, we don't have enough problems in medical care. We have, like, and this is the solution. Every single human that comes in here, we have to say to them, excuse me, sir, you're 60, you know, you're 40 and you're a male. Do you have a uterus? Like, what? Like, it's just, that's not.
And just think about how far this takes us backwards for those of us who are feminists, that now a woman is reduced to a body part.
Yes.
I mean, it is the height of infuriating. So what happens if I had, some sort of cancer, and at the age of 30, I had to have my uterus removed in order to save my life? Am I no longer a woman? This is insane. Listen, before we get off, because I know we have like 5 minutes, I do want to plug someone who's in the chat, and that is Dr. Lauren Schwartz. She's the wonderful person that I spoke to a few weeks ago, and we spent a wonderful time getting to know each other. And she does excellent good exploratory, trauma-informed work, and I would absolutely endorse her. She's at www.genderexploratory.com. That is a good resource for you moms and dads or out there. And I like to end conversations on a can-do note, because there's a lot of crap out there, and there's so many things that are alarming. And there are times when it's appropriate to be alarmed. In fact, there are times where if you're not alarmed, you got a problem. And here it is appropriate to be alarmed, but I don't want to end in the alarm. The alarm is that there is an agenda. It's not just activists. There's not any one political party that's saying this. I am observing this as a practitioner, giving my life to this work. There is an agenda to drive a wedge between children and their parents so that someone other than their parents can make decisions for them and therefore have power and influence over their lives. We're seeing it in the schools. We're seeing it in more and more medical care where parents are being peeled off one way or the other in medical decisions for their child. They're being asked to leave the room when doctors are talking to minors, pediatricians. And I could go on, and Jamie can back me up in this. There are ways in which the decision-making of parents are being undermined by education and medical professionals. And I say to parents this: trust your instincts, know who you are, and be ready to assert your parental authority, because that is what's best for a child. That is the best interests of child is protected by their parents. And, so here's the positive note. Of all the issues that we have today that are tearing our country apart, this is an issue that is actually uniting us. Okay. I talk to parents on the far left. Jamie, by her own disclosure, I talk to parents on the far right, very religious, Orthodox, and etc. And I don't say what I am but I am hearing this unanimity of voice around this issue saying, no, you can't come into my house. You can't have access to my child. You can't make these decisions for me. Because it will harm my child. I know what's best for them. And so, let's come together around on this. And again, I tell you, tell your stories. I put my email somewhere in the chat. You can tell your stories now using a pseudonym in courts. Courts are more and more allowing witnesses to use pseudonyms because they're letting the plaintiffs use pseudonyms. So they have to allow it on our side as well. We can find ways to protect your privacy, but we can't protect your kids if these laws get overturned and we lose in these court battles. We can't protect you anymore. So please do come forward, tell your stories. And again, if you have the financial ability to support us, go on and financially support us, and stand up with your medical associations. I'm telling you, doctors, I guarantee you, there are far more of you who believe that they are troubled by this, far more. They just intimidate you into silence. Well, don't be. Jamie wasn't intimidated. She laid her life on the line. What have you, can't the rest of us do something similar? I shut my practice down to give my life completely to the practice of law to protect children. So can other people kind of, lay it out too? So that's my upbeat, that's my call to action. But also, I think we love our kids more than they do. I believe we stand together, we can take them back. So that's my pledge.
And we do actually have a few more minutes if you still
Good.
have time.
Bernadette, you touched on an amazing topic though, which is basically, yes, this is bridging a lot of political divides, but part of the hugest positive I've seen since blowing the whistle is that I am so much more open to the concept that, we can totally have a dialogue on this. And then recognize that at the end of the day, we don't have to agree on every single point and all have the same mind melded. We are not the Borg. If anybody knows any Star Trek references, we do not have to have a collective thought process. Vernadette and I are from wildly different political concepts, and yet we are practicing this idea that as adult humans, we can have conversations and say at the end, hey, we don't agree on that point, but hey, we can still be friends. I can still talk to my next door neighbor, even though they voted for somebody different. That is part of the way out of this mess, is that we start fixing this concept that we cannot talk to people and that everybody has to have groupthink. that's the thing that's so troubling ideologically about the left right now as a whole. I am actually pro-diversity, and that means diversity in thought as well, and language and ideas and concepts.
Yeah, and that's why I think, organizations like FAIR, where when I'm not in the hospital, I spend my time helping, because we are really dedicated to, trying to bring people back together and talk about the issues, because that's how we solve the problems, figure out what's best. But also just in healthcare, there is, this is the only issue I've ever heard of where people aren't raising, when you have a safety concern, like when I'm in the hospital, there's a safety concern. It's like people are trained to talk about it and say, oh my gosh, wait, their person's vitals or this, Dr. Mendoza, did you see that? Or, oh, like I found more meds in their bag, or the family told me X. Like everything is geared around talking and people speaking up. So that is what we're trying to do by doing these webinars. And there's, a lot of other great organizations that have popped up to try and, bolster up different elements, like Do No Harm's doing a great job with helping with, legislative efforts and raising awareness. And, a lot of the parent groups, Parents Defending Education and FAIR, we have a lot of parent stuff too. But also within medicine, people have to understand there is a hierarchy. Okay. The whole idea that hierarchies are bad, which is part of this movement, ends up that people get hurt. In medicine, there is a hierarchy of knowledge. It doesn't mean you don't listen to safety concerns, but doctors need to be brave and step into their role as saying, wait a second, this is wrong. The buck stops with me. Okay. Maybe in emergency medicine, it comes more of a natural role because, things are more instantaneous and we are dealing with when people have problems, not like a clinic dealing with chronic conditions or, things of that nature. But you have to have moral courage to step up and say when things are wrong. I pick up the phone and I ask for the CMO of the hospital when I'm having an issue. And I've done it in the middle of the night. Why? Because that is my job. When there is a problem in the hospital and I can't get people to do what needs to be done for the safety of the patient. So every physician out there needs to do the same thing. Your role is to be the moral leader, and you're not helping kids' mental health by caving in to things that are not science-based, that are pseudoscience. And I also want people to know that, the longest study that's done on happiness is out of Harvard. They're still running it since I think the 1930s, following people their whole lives. The main thing that is an indicator of happiness is your relationship with your family. People who are disconnected from their family are not as happy long-term.
And what the second main thing is?
What?
The second main thing is living for something other than yourself.
Right.
That the least happy people, I'm pretty sure I know that study from Harvard. Yeah. The least happy people were the people that were very self-focused. The happiest were people who were living for something bigger than themselves, for others. That was, I think that was the second highest indicator of happiness. So that's what we're talking about today.
Right. But not dividing up the family. You have to understand things, a solution that cuts you off from relationships is not a solution for happiness. Even everybody can have difficult relationships in their family, but you have to push through. And so when this medical ideology is saying, hey, we're going to cut you off from your parents because we know best, that's a huge red flag. And then the second thing is, we touch not as much on the idea around suicidality that is often brought up. Anybody, when during the opioid epidemic, people say, if you don't write me this prescription, I'm going to kill myself. I'd say, well, okay, you're going over for a psych eval, because anybody who has a coping mechanism of doing that is maladaptive. you don't cope that way. And anyone in a medical profession telling you if you don't do X, your kid is going to kill themselves, that should be malpractice. That's not how people in any healthcare situation talk. I have never heard anyone in any setting talk that way.
Can I chime in on that, Carrie?
Yeah, sure. Please do.
That is, in my view, legal coercion.
Yep.
I don't believe it is possible to get truly informed consent from a parent who's been told that statement, because you have just subjected that person to psychological manipulation and emotional coercion. What parent is going to say, no, cut whatever you want, as long as you don't cut off my child's head, what could possibly be worse than death? Right? You have coerced that parent. There is no longer getting informed consent from that parent. And those are the kind of stories that we want to hear. I'm going to give our website again, and then Dr. Schwartz, because I'm seeing in here that somehow it's not showing up in the chat. So again, Dr. Lauren Schwartz is www.genderexploratory.com, genderexploratory.com. And we are childparentrights.org. I do actually have to go pretty soon.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Gary. But if there's any, maybe final quick questions we can wrap up for either Jamie and me, that would be awesome.
And Vernadette, I'll add 3 sentences on top of the legal coercion. So from your perspective, that's legal coercion. From my perspective, that is falling outside of medical ethics. So medical ethics state, basically, is this intervention necessary? Are there alternatives to try? Does the patient have the capacity to fully weigh the risks and benefits? And then at the end of it, is the patient and their family free from undue influence? And undue influence in this situation is those threats, but also I think the social contagion aspect leads to the undue influence at this point. So I found myself writing those 4 medical ethical questions over and over again and trying to answer for myself how this practice falls within medical ethics. And I could not answer an affirmative. It is not necessary. There are strong alternatives to try, and patients need to be able to fully consent and have the capacity. And that was part of what led me to be a whistleblower. I could not see that we were avoiding unnecessary harm.
Well, thank you both so much. And can they, we've put the Vernadette, your website in multiple times, which is great, but is that the best way for them to reach you, or is there a general email? And then Jamie, if people want to reach out to you, should they do that through Vernadette?
At this point, yes.
Okay.
Yeah, and so to reach me, there's a contact page on the website that you can, it'll go to sort of a general place, and then my paralegals and my assistant will go through these. If you reference this podcast, then it'll be handled appropriately. I also put in my paralegal's email, because she's the one who's really helping me spearhead the outreach to parents and detransitioners. I kind of not giving out my email as much because I get so many, I can't barely practice law, but between those two, they will get sent to the right place. And yeah.
Okay, thank you. And I do want, Lauren Schwartz is one of our Fair Medicine fellows, and you can, reach her through, Fair in Medicine. She does amazing work. We've got amazing fellows. Maud Marin's our new interim executive director, who's very supportive of us doing this. So I want to thank her and my team at Fair, and everyone out there on the internet, and Vernadette and Jamie. Thank you so much. Your courage is contagious, and I know, at Fair we're trying to be right there with you to be part of the solution. So with that, we are going to close, and thank you everybody very much. And we will see you at our next programming event, which is to be determined. So thank you.